Good afternoon and a warm welcome to all of you joining us for this Rathbone Greenbank and Real Wild Estates lunchtime webinar. I'm Sophie Lawrence and I'm the Stewardship and Engagement Lead at Rathbone Greenbank. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Greenbank, we are the specialist, ethical, sustainable and impact investment business within Rathbone's group. We've been managing bespoke portfolios for our range of private clients, charities and trusts for over 20 years. We have a long track record of using investor engagement to create positive environmental or social changes on a diverse range of issues, from climate change to modern slavery and health and nutrition, all underpinned by our rigorous approach to ethical, sustainable and impact research and screening. The Greenbank team is made up of over 65 team members across Bristol, London, Liverpool, Glasgow and Edinburgh. And please do get in touch with a member of our team if you would like to learn more. Now, before we launch into this really exciting topic of rewilding and reward, I have a few quick housekeeping pieces to run through. First, if you would like to submit a question for our panel discussion at the end, please do so via the engagement panel on the right of your screen. You are also welcome to post your questions anonymously if you prefer, and we've already received some really great questions from you all as you registered, so thank you for those. We also have some Greenbank publications available for you to download from the engagement panel on the right side of your screen, including a write-up of our recent biodiversity roundtable. And throughout the presentations, if you're on social media, please use the hashtags Rathbone Greenbank and Green Shoots. If you do happen to lose connection, then please try and rejoin through the event link. And if you're having any issues using the conference portal, then please click the headphone mic icon in the top right corner, which is also available on the engagement panel under Stream Assistance. Now, if we look at the agenda, so we have 3 10-minute presentations and our event will conclude with a panel discussion. I'll be kicking off our session today, exploring whether there is a role for private finance in nature-based solutions. I'll then invite Benedict Macdonald and Hirsch from Real Wild Estates to speak. Benedict will be talking about what we mean by nature restoration and why it's so important. And Tass will be talking about the diverse income stacking approach that they use at Real Wild Estates. So let's dive in. If we move to the next slide. So starting with the question, is there a role for private finance in nature restoration? Well, there's certainly no hiding away from the scale of the challenge that we face when it comes to the decline in global and local biodiversity and nature more generally. Whether you're looking at WWF's latest Global Living Planet Index or the RSPP's State of Nature in the UK report, they all unfortunately paint a gloomy picture. Now, as with any complex sustainability challenge, there is a role for several players if we're going to reverse the decline. But what could be the role specifically for private finance? The first thing we need to consider is the current financing gap. And the Green Finance Institute has done some very thorough research in this area to explore the difference between required spending and committed or planned spending associated with the delivery of a set of eight nature-related outcomes, such as clean water, protection of biodiversity, and natural flood management. And these outcomes are based on the 25-year Environment Plan for England. And what this report found was that there was an annual gap in financing of up to 6.1 billion, which you can see on this slide. The largest finance gap regionally lies within England, followed by Scotland, whilst the largest gap with regards to outcomes are found with climate mitigation through biocarbon, which is focused on land use that reduces greenhouse gas emissions and increases carbon sequestration, and also the protection and/or restoration of biodiversity. And if we move to the next slide, looking globally, we see the same trend. The United Nations Environment Programme released the State of Finance for Nature report alongside the World Economic Forum and other partners last year. And the report tracks global trends in public and private investment in nature-based solutions, aiming to improve data quality and identify opportunities for governments, businesses, and the investment community. And the report finds that there's a $4.1 trillion financing gap needed by 2050 in nature-based solutions. And this is really linked as well to the world remaining on track to meet the Paris Climate Agreement. Currently, only 3% of this is tapped, mainly by public financing, an amount which will need to at least triple by 2030. Now, if we think about this gap, an increase in public funding would definitely help to plug some of it, but the gap is unlikely to be met unless we also see a significant private sector investment in nature-based solutions. So moving on to the next slide, we've established that there is a significant financing gap. And although public funding and philanthropy will remain absolutely critical in achieving nature-related targets, we will not deliver on commitments if we continue to rely solely on these sources of funding alone. There is therefore a really compelling case to develop well-designed environmental markets, which are delivering real environmental improvement and benefiting local communities. But there are definitely some barriers which are preventing this, and I wanted to spend a little bit of time looking at some of these. So firstly, we have a systemic undervaluation of nature and the absence of drivers for the private sector to invest in its conservation, restoration and management means that there are limited sources of revenue from nature to fund investment. There's also uncertainty and complexity created by the lack of coherence between the approach to environmental regulation, existing public funding mechanisms and incentives, which result in very high costs to participate in the market, otherwise known as transaction costs, and these can create significant disincentives for investment in nature-based projects. The limited capacity of the current supply chain to deliver a robust and reliable pipeline of nature-based projects also means that projects cannot be readily aggregated to investment scale. And it's also really hard to price the risk of nature-based solutions, as projects are relatively new and still a largely unfamiliar category of asset for the finance and investment community. There is also often low liquidity and a long time horizon required for investment, which can make it unsuitable for some investors. But if we move to the next slide, we also want to focus on some of the solutions. There is definitely a lot of work going into ensuring that the market for nature and the environmental services that nature provides has the potential to harness the capabilities and resources of the private sector to efficiently deploy capital and encourage the innovation that's needed. So looking at a couple of these solutions in a little bit more detail, there are some successful examples of public and private sector cooperation in scaling up investments, including the use of blended finance, where public finance or grant money can be used in combination with private finance to de-risk an investment. Public capital can also be used to aggregate nature-based projects at a catchment or regional level to achieve the scale necessary to attract private investment. And the Biosphere Foundation in the UK is doing some really interesting work in this area with peatland restoration. Once this has happened and the projects have sufficient diversification, they may have a much more suitable risk-return profile, which is possible for mainstream investors to invest in. And on this note, it was really interesting to see one of the commitments to have come out of COP27, which was a commitment from the UK to start a £30 million seed finance Big Nature Impact Fund. There have also been some exciting new innovations to support with measurement of nature-related impacts, such as DNA sequencing to measure biodiversity on the ground. And you can read more about some of these barriers and solutions by looking at the brilliant work of the Financing Nature Recovery UK initiative, which was established in November 2020 with the aim of putting nature on a sustainable financial path. It brought together over 300 industry leaders from the land management, business, finance and environmental sectors across the UK. The diagram on this slide also looks at some of the actions which the UNEP State of Finance for Nature report, which we looked at earlier, suggests to accelerate finance for nature-based solutions. And the last two, measure and decarbonise, are a good segue into my final slide, looking at our wider work on this topic at Greenbank. So reducing exposure to negative nature-related impacts through understanding where the risks lie in our portfolios and then engaging with companies across several different industries on this issue is also a really important part of the equation if we're going to reduce the decline in nature, as well as over time, hopefully finding the right opportunities to invest directly in nature-based solutions that are appropriate for our clients. A few things to highlight, which you can see on the slide as a summary of our work in this area. So first, we signed up to the Finance for Biodiversity Pledge in 2020, committing to measure our impact on biodiversity, engage with our holdings and set targets. To support us on this journey, we've been an active member of the Partnership for Biodiversity Accounting Financials, working alongside 30 other investors over the last 18 months to develop consistent standards for biodiversity impact assessment and measurement. Now, also on here, you can see the COP15 logo, which is the equivalent to COP27, but focused on nature. And this is happening in a few weeks' time, and I'll be joining the Finance for Biodiversity delegation there, where global leaders will come together to try and agree an ambitious global biodiversity framework, similar to what the Paris Agreement established for climate change. The framework would set out a plan to bring about a transformation in society's relationship with biodiversity, to preserve and protect nature and its essential services. And the finance community is calling for wording to be added to the framework on private financial flows as well as public, and also pushing for mandatory disclosure of biodiversity impacts for businesses and financial institutions, which, if achieved, could really help push the needle. Greenbank also hosted a roundtable with some key people working on the topic of biodiversity, representing data providers, NGOs, investors, and academics. And we came together with the aim of breaking down silos between the different groups and identifying some of the ways we can work better together. There was definitely consensus that strong regulation is needed and that measurement techniques still need some work to enable us to understand the complex ecosystem impacts of companies at the portfolio level. And you can download the full report from the engagement panel on the right of your screen. We've also been engaging directly with a group of holdings which we've identified as having the highest impact on biodiversity loss. We are often the first investor to be having a conversation about their approach to biodiversity, and we'll be thinking about how we can set more stringent objectives for companies to meet next year, supported by the release of the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, which is pushing companies to disclose their material nature-related impacts. The framework will be similar to TCFD, or the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, and which is now mandatory for companies in the UK with over 500 employees and over 500 million in turnover. And we expect the two frameworks to combine in the future and for the nature equivalent to also become mandatory. So to bring us back to nature restoration, I'd now like to introduce Benedict Macdonald, who is the head of nature restoration at Real Estates. Benedict is a conservationist and the author of not one, but 3 excellent books about the natural world, including the Wainwright Prize-winning Manifesto for Ecological Restoration, Rebirding, which I had the pleasure of reading on a recent cycling trip to the Outer Hebrides, which was a very fitting place to read it. Over to you, Ben.
Sophie, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to Sophie and Rathbone for hosting us, and thank you for coming. My name is Benedict Macdonald. I'm head of nature restoration for the Real Estates company, and we are a company specialising in large-scale but financially viable nature restoration projects across the UK, both with existing landowners and those seeking to buy land for the purpose of carbon sequestration, climate resilience, but most of all, the much-needed nature recovery here in the United Kingdom, where we need it the most. Next slide, please. So Britain faces an unusual dichotomy in that we have the most nature lovers per capita in the world, but we also have the worst nature in Europe. We are amongst the most nature depleted countries on earth, and yet we have this extraordinary groundswell of love for the natural world, whether the David Attenborough shows and Springwatch, whether the enormous membership of the RSPB and our NGOs and the National Trust. We appear to have this extraordinary will to reverse nature recovery in this country, and yet the mechanisms for doing so have catastrophically eluded us in recent decades. Whilst we've seen Poland, Finland, Spain all restore large areas of their countryside to a profitable natural state, in the UK we lag very much behind the curve, hence the formation of our private sector business to become a piece in the puzzle of solving biodiversity loss and reversing that loss at a very aspirational level here in the United Kingdom. As a business, we effectively have 2 wings. We're not here to tell you too much about ourselves. We're here to talk about the greater goal of nature restoration, but effectively we help investors or individuals to acquire land for the purposes of nature restoration and high-end regenerative farming. And we also work with existing landowners who are looking for a new roadmap for their estate, whether that is a small farm looking to biodiversify, or perhaps our more traditional clientele of a large shooting landowner wanting to leave a more sustainable legacy to the next generation on a 7,000-acre estate in Scotland and everywhere in between. So that's what we do as a business. But the business has come into formation out of a state of ecological necessity. Whilst in the United Kingdom, we have been very good at reversing the decline of particular species. We've been very good at safeguarding our seabird colonies. We've been very good at buying what David Cameron would call ecological postage stamps of land. There has been no joined up cohesive landscape level policy for nature restoration here in the UK, which puts us in stark contrast to the United States, to France, and to many other first world countries. And now we believe is the time to really start supercharging this. What makes our business somewhat unique is that we have paired ambitious ecological goals with equally viable financial a financial backbone that allows those goals to be possible both for landowners and for investors, because fundamentally we have to make nature restoration more profitable than degrading land use. Otherwise, it will be difficult for there to be a large-scale switch. You may have philanthropists switching, you may have charities, you may have individual isolated players making moves towards nature restoration. But unless we can run nature restoration as a viable business model, we will not see the large-scale switches needed to affect the change so dramatically needed here in the United Kingdom. Next slide, please. Why is nature restoration important? It's important because we need to restore nature. This puts us in a very different position from somewhere like the Peruvian Amazon, where the imperative is to keep the nature that is already there. There is nothing wrong with the Amazon rainforest. It is a pristine, unique system that we need to protect. There is nothing wrong with our coral reefs. We need to keep those systems in a state of ecological preservation. However, the United Kingdom, having been depleted so early on in our history, requires very significant acts of restoration, which singles apart our business from others who specialize in conserving what is left. We specialize in putting back what often hasn't been there for a very long time in the past. Now, the image you're looking at here is an aerial map taken, I believe, 15 years apart of the inspiring Knepp estate in Sussex, the subject of the very famous book Rewilding, run by Isabella Tree and Charlie Bull. And this has been a scheme that, instead of embracing zoo management, as I call it, zoological gardening, it has embraced ecological processes in the way that it has turned the land back to nature. And you only have to see on the left, you have a system that is losing carbon, that is leaching biodiversity, that is extremely simplified, indeed, like most of the British landscape. And on the right, you have a wonderfully complex system of naturalistic processes, grassland, scrub, wetland, and woodland, all combining together, but obviously delivering some fairly punchy economic benefits through carbon sequestration, and also, of course, through the ecotourism operation and diversification that estate is able to run. Next slide, please. So a lot of what we do is working with landowners to create very ambitious ecological recovery projects. However, those projects require capital injection at the start, and therefore they have to be able to deliver on the financials later on to make that viable. One point it's worth making is that the British countryside has become dependent on extremely vulnerable land ownership and land management models. Grouse moors, you are literally putting all your eggs in one basket. Deer estates, you have a very small window of fiscal activity where you can make a profit within the year. We believe that by diversifying a landscape, you can also simultaneously diversify the revenue streams coming from that landscape, not to mention doing the right thing for nature and the planet. Next slide, please. Scale is the great missing ingredient when it comes to nature restoration here in the UK. We've been very good at the small, and now we need to become very good at the big. Now, many people will ask, well, what about food production? Well, in fact, if you're very analytical about where food production happens here in Britain, there are large areas of the UK that are actually not producing any meaningful quantity of food, or indeed any food at the moment at all. 8% of Britain is managed as grouse moor, 8% as deer estate, very large areas of upland sheep grazing that are actually functioning at a trophic loss when it comes to human food production. So there are many areas in the UK that are suitable for these large, ambitious, carbon sequestering, ecological restoration projects with zero impact on food production, which generally takes place in its most concentrated fashion in the east and the south of the United Kingdom. So often clients will be approaching us with failing estates, for example. They're looking for new revenue streams, they're looking for better biodiversity, but often we find it's actually their children who are looking for longevity, climate resilience, and a future in that landscape. And I think that's a really important point to make. Next slide, please. We have forgotten what a naturalistic system looks like in the UK. Even our nature reserves are incredibly manicured gardens for certain species. We as a company aspire towards allowing nature a little bit more free rein in the landscape. For example, this is the Bieszczba marshes in Poland, a system that absorbs vast quantities of carbon, a natural river system where housing and farming works around the rhythms of the river, not the other way around. And whilst this may seem a very distant reality here in the UK, we're actually seeing some very inspiring dialogue in places like the Somerset Levels, where farmers are realizing that the current model of land drainage and consequent, flooding from maize washing into drainage ditches that then subsequently flood is unviable for everyone, including those farming the land. And these more naturalistic systems are actually becoming asked for by farmers and landowners on the land, not simply a external demand from the city and guardianistas, as this is sometimes characterized. Next slide, please. Ecosystem engineers are a very important part of what we do. We're beginning to realize that flood prevention, but also water retention in summer, as we've seen with the drought of the previous year, is going to be absolutely critical to the survival of our farmers, not merely the survival of wild animals. So we're a huge advocate of species like beavers, keeping water on the land in summer, but preventing downstream flooding, especially in steep areas like Cornwall in the winter. Next slide, please. The idea that rewilding or ecological restoration can't be combined with farming livelihoods is, we believe, a myth, because we are working with farmers and gamekeepers on a very regular basis. And often these are the stakeholders most excited by the change from a system that was actually losing the money, like extensive sheep grazing, towards premium organic beef, towards a more diversified farming model. And we find that especially people of my generation, farmers of my generation, are particularly excited by the possibilities of change and diversification that ecological restoration or rewilding brings to their land holding. Next slide, please. This is a long game. We're not claiming that anything that we talk about is going to deliver instant profits, although there are short and long-term revenue streams, as my colleague Tassilo will come to in a minute. But if you have a diverse landscape, you have a diversity of wildlife, you have climate resilience, you have more jobs, and you have a better chance of taking that landholding sustainably into the future. And that is the business model that we are advocating at Real Wild Estates. Next slide, please. Most importantly of all, for me, in many ways, is the jobs creation opportunities, very much overlooked and I have to say misrepresented in sectors of the media. The fact is that if you diversify your estate, you are creating more futures, not less. And I think that's a really important point on which to end this presentation. Next slide, please, if we have one. I'll pass back to Sophie. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben. Some really stunning imagery there, but also you painted a really compelling picture of why we need to act and think about ecological restoration in the UK and also beyond the UK. I'd now like to introduce Tass von Hirsch, who leads the natural capital assessment, valuation and policy work at Real Wild Estates. And prior to Real Wild Estates, Tass worked as a sustainability and climate change consultant at Deloitte and PwC. Tass, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the kind intro, Sophie, and pleasure to be here and see so many people signed up for this as well, which is really encouraging. Sophie's mentioned in her section how we need to urgently close the what is a gaping biodiversity finance gap. So over the course of the next 10 minutes, I'm going to explain, first of all, what natural capital is, its role in creating the income streams that will help close the gap, And then at the end, using a quick indicative case study, how we at Real Wild Estates can go about helping clients in the UK achieve that. Next slide, please. So probably the first thing to ask is, what is natural capital? You may well have heard this term bandied around a lot, including in my job title, no less. So it's probably worth looking at it in more detail. Essentially, it is the world's stock of natural assets, which includes things like soil, air, water, and all living things. Natural capital assets then comprise ecosystem services, which are the range of services which enable life on Earth as we know it and provide a good quality of life. They power our economies, our recreation, our culture, and our health. Some examples would be the likes of pollination, waste disposal, and the provision of clean air and water. There's a lot of focus on the sort of biophysical elements of ecosystem services, but that's just as true for mental health aspects as well, including spirituality, quality of life, and mental health, which are harder to place a financial value on, but no less important. And I think something that we saw in the case of the pandemic as well. On the right-hand side, we have a picture of of peatland there, which is a really good example of a natural capital asset providing ecosystem services. So on the one hand, it provides water filtration, which is very important for, let's say, utilities and any other stakeholders managing the water catchment. It also provides water regulation, which Benedict alluded to. So it breaks the cycle of drought and flash flooding that we've seen increasingly over the years. And almost most importantly, it provides a huge amount of carbon sequestration. In fact, peatland lays down carbon at a rate of 1 millimeter a year. So if you see a peatland which has a meter of peat in it, that's taken 1,000 years to accumulate. So it's a very crucial carbon buffer. Off the back of these ecosystem services, there are a range of payments that have been developed, which are essentially market mechanisms that I'll come to in the next slide. These can come from public and private. Sorry, could we go back one slide, actually? Thank you. So these are a combination of public and private. And although the public funding is often conflated with subsidy, in fact, it's actually a public payment for public goods. Finally, we have the diverse stacking, which is alluded to in the title. Now, this is essentially the layering on top of different payments for ecosystem services on the same bit of land. The idea is that as long as you are paid for different ecosystem services, such as carbon sequestration and biodiversity, then in theory, you can stack as much as you like, as long as you're not paying twice for the same ecosystem service. Now, the government is supposed to publish some rules on this by the end of the year, so we'll have a much clearer understanding of it shortly. Next slide, please. So let's look at some examples of what these natural capital income streams are. Perhaps the most well-known will be carbon credits, and that can come in the form of woodland creation or natural regeneration. It can be avoided emissions through the restoration of peatland, and then it can also be some of the more nascent schemes like farm soil carbon, salt marsh and wetland, and even hedgerow carbon. Worth pointing out there's a spectrum of maturity here, with the woodland being the most established, peatland being relatively new but established, and then the likes of farm soil carbon also established but nascent, and then salt marsh and wetland carbon and hedgerow carbon all planned for finalization in the next couple of years. We can also then look at agri-environment schemes and countryside stewardship in particular. So CS is the incumbent agri-environment scheme. It is not the basic payment scheme, which is the legacy of the EU's Common Agricultural Policy, which is a subsidy. And essentially this provides public money for public goods. Again, biodiversity, clean air and water, so swimmable rivers and lakes, and soil quality. That's going to be replaced by something called the Environmental Land Management Scheme, or ELMS, which is the post-Brexit arrangement and the future of English agri-environment schemes. It's supposed to be new and improved. For those of you following the news, you may well have seen that its future is uncertain, both in terms of its existence and also its detail. But we suspect that once it all comes out in the wash, it will still be around and stronger than before. There's also biodiversity credits, biodiversity net gain, which some of you may have heard of, which is mandated by law for UK developers and will be fully operational by the end of next year. And that is essentially forcing or requiring home builders to offset the impacts of their development. Then there are also a range of voluntary biodiversity credits coming online, which are going to cater to corporates and investor nature agendas, a bit like voluntary carbon credits as well. Those are in development at the moment, but we expect to see them be finalized and actually scale up massively in the next year or two. Finally, there are also water payments, which is a small market, but growing market. And again, you see the likes of private sector buyers like housing developers and water utilities paying those who manage water catchments for clean water, flood mitigation, and absorption of various nitrates and fertilizers. Next slide, please. So let's come to an example then of a UK lowland landscape and what this might look like. So this has it's worth mentioning it's an indicative example, but based on real life. The purchase price would be £10.5 million, including renovation. Now that obviously wouldn't apply if anyone owns land already. The incumbent land use is low-grade arable and pasture, and it's about 750 acres. So the way we would approach it is there are various income streams which we can maximize here, including lettable houses, a commercial real estate strategy, nature tourism with cabins, carbon sequestration, biodiversity net gain, and some agri-environment payments. It's probably worth pointing out that the real estate is not us going in building new things. It's merely the conversion of existing assets, the likes of cottages, barns, which maybe are no longer used or needed for the storage of cattle or machinery, and instead can be renovated and turned into office space or high-end holiday lettings. Next slide, please. So then, with all those income streams in play, it's worth looking at how this accrues value to the client or the landowner. So the first chart is a holistic appraisal of the total value creation, and you can see the yellow bars there essentially being the estate value, which is the 10.5 million, appreciating every year by approximately 4.6%, which is land value increase taken from the Bank of England. So that creates the majority of the value in a holistic sense. But then you see on top the green and the blue, which is the actual income that you're getting, cash in your pocket from natural capital and commercial respectively. And once you add in those two elements, you then get a compound annual growth rate of about 5.24% over the 30-year period, which is the timeframe we model to. So it's a healthy return, which is underpinned by land value appreciation and therefore a pretty safe bet. On the right-hand side, you then see the green and the blue bars broken down into their respective revenue streams. And what we see actually is, for a lowland example, probably proportionally, there's more contribution coming from the commercial or the real estate because there's less land available, and there's probably a bigger and wealthier catchment for eco-tourism and real estate potential there. Next slide, please. And then finally, we can see a bit of a scenario comparison here between the blue line on top, which is our nature restoration proposal, and the green line underneath, which is the business as usual. So the top one is our forecast income, and the one beneath, the reported average income from the low-grade arable and pasture, including 1 year, which was actually quite heavily loss-making. So you'll see that there's a healthy amount of daylight between the two on an annual basis. And so this is net income, which is after costs and management fees. And then on the right-hand side, we can see the cumulative approach to this, which sees that gap widening throughout the 30-year period. And again, big difference between the two. So with that, I'd like to wrap up the presentation, and hopefully we've been able to show you that there is significant potential here, significant risk diversification as well, and huge opportunities at play. And if we could go to the next slide, please. I'd just like to say thank you for registering and taking the time out of your days to listen to us. Appreciate it's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour, and we've glossed over a fair amount of pretty complex topics. So if you have any questions around natural capital or want to learn more about what we might be able to do for you, then do get in touch with us directly or via Sophie and the Greenbank team. And otherwise, thank you again very much for your time and attention, and to Rathbone. And I will hand back to Sophie.
Thanks so much, Tass. I can't quite believe that we're still on time. We were quite worried with this lunchtime webinar that we were getting through a lot in 45 minutes. So thank you to both of you for those brilliant presentations. So without further ado, let's bring you both back, and hopefully you're joining me on the screen for everyone for some Q&A, a short Q&A session. We've had so many questions in advance and lots as well during the call. So thank you so much to all of you who have raised some. And there's definitely some common threads appearing. Yeah, we'll try and bring as many of those to Benedict and Tass now. So to start us off, maybe one which is a little bit kind of simpler to answer, hopefully. Is there a minimum size of plot required before rewilding makes sense? And Ben, I don't know if you want to start with that one.
Certainly, thank you, Sophie. I think it's fair to say that from a completely non-elitist perspective, nature needs space, and space is the ingredient that it's been denied here in the United Kingdom. So there's no denying that a 7,000-acre deer estate committing to rewild will have a greater ecological effect. You will begin to see the formation of meta-populations. So these are not just one or two box-ticking black grouse, for example, but a whole population of 100 black grouse that can stand the test of time is obviously more sustainable in the long term, and something that forms the kind of the A game, I suppose, of our business at Real Wild Estates. At the same time, I think we've got to be very careful of taking this into the sphere of elitism and big landowners. And there's an enormous amount you can do on 1 acre, 10 acres, or 50 acres, or indeed in your garden. And we are increasingly operating at every scale. So from a nature benefit point of view, then the answer is any scale will work, provided you can maximize the biodiversity and naturalness and ambition within that landscape. Obviously, from a carbon sequestration and a financials point of view, there's no denying that the larger the landscape, particularly in Northern England or Scotland, the more punchy the returns will be on your peatland or your woodland carbon.
Brilliant, thank you. Now I wanted to move on to a theme that we've had a lot of questions around, which is the policy environment, which you've both touched on in your presentations. And Tass, you mentioned the ELM scheme and yeah, some of the changes that have been coming out around that. But maybe kind of starting with the big picture, do you both feel the government are taking rewilding and ecological restoration seriously? I don't know who wants to start, whether Ben, you want to start with the bigger picture and we can kind of dial into some of the more specifics.
Sure. I mean, as we know, government is prone to quite a lot of change at the moment. And I suppose as a business, we try and take a 15 to 30-year perspective for our clients. So we have to some degree, outride short-termism, whether that's media headlines or sudden rowbacks in certain government policies. I think it's fair to say that maybe this administration's been underestimated for the seriousness with which certain players have taken nature restoration. I think we're very encouraged by the direction of Natural England under Tony Juniper. We're quite encouraged by the public money for public goods side of ELMS. And obviously we as a business would want to see that aspiration kept high, with that higher tier of ELMS reserved for these really ambitious projects. I think at the same time, there's a lot of myth making around rewilding being a threat to food production, but in fact, it's intensive livestock farming and food production is often a threat to more sustainable food production, whether that's of fruit or vegetables, of these highly beneficial foodstuffs that only cover a very small percentage of the United Kingdom compared to maize, for example, that then goes into the cattle that we then eat with a very ineffective system. So I think there's still some misunderstanding of what nature restoration is at the governmental level. But I do believe that we're moving in the right direction.
Great. And Tass, you mentioned, the income stacking model, and you showed us some real examples. I mean, how dependent are the income streams, from nature restoration that are in your models on kind of appropriate subsidies, incentives for government, proper polluter pays, regulations?
Yeah, it's a good question. It'll be quite case and client specific. I mean, the first thing I'd say is that I usually challenge the framing of it as subsidy, because there is in fact subsidy, which is the basic payment scheme, where essentially there's no real value creation to the broader public, and it is a distortion of economics in some ways, and for that reason the government are now scrapping it. So it is very much a payment for ecosystem services. It's just whether the buyer of those services is public, i.e. the government on behalf of the people, or the private market. I suppose if you were to go down an agri-environment scheme route, you know how much you're going to be getting paid if you're accepted onto the scheme. So that provides a certain amount of clarity and reassurance. Whereas if you go down the private route, at the moment, there's no guarantee what you're going to get for your woodland carbon units, for your biodiversity net gain. It'll depend on how the project is managed, the biodiversity you manage to attract, and the market itself. I mean, the voluntary carbon market is precisely that. It's voluntary, it's not regulated. Chances are it's a pretty good market to join, because the rate we're going, there's going to be more and more demand for carbon credits. But who's to say there isn't a black swan event which comes down the line and damages prices? So it depends what your risk appetite is, and it depends also what your own personal views are, whether you think you want to accept money from the government or whether you want to embrace the free markets, entrepreneurship, and so on. But I think at any rate, there's a government needs to have a role, whether it's actually buying the services itself or requiring companies to offset their impacts through legislation.
Great, thanks. And you also touched on a couple of other areas we've had quite a few questions around, which is the carbon market. One we had through during the presentation, which I think is interesting, is have the successful large-scale ecological preservation projects that you mentioned, Benedict, in other European countries. I think you showed an example in Poland. Have they been based on the financialization model, or were they driven by public financing?
I think the answer is both, but I think it's also important to bear in mind that the early prototypes are not necessarily indicative of the direction in which we're headed. I think conventionally, certainly in the United Kingdom, we've been incredibly dependent on this idea of, farmers and landowners always come up to us and say, how can I get the next government payment? And we say, well, before you ask the question, think about the framing of that question. The question is, how can you make this viable, including government payments? And I think in other countries, there is a stronger sense of what a national park is, for example. I think there's a stronger sense a national park is a place that preserves and enhances natural assets, rather than perhaps in the UK, more of a focus on preserving and freezing cultural landscapes like, Lake District farming in time. So I think other countries are more interventionist at the governmental level with funding the protection of these big remaining ecosystems. But I think in Poland, the point is a lot of these systems were never taken away. What we have to do is put them back, which is obviously much more bold and requires much more financial investment to restore a system than merely preserve an existing system like Yellowstone or the Serengeti. To do that, we're going to need vast amounts of private sector capital, and simply there is not enough money in government to deliver these aims, and therefore bridging between the private sector and land reformation, land acquisition is going to be really important.
Great, and I think that's definitely a core message from today, that there is that gap and that private finance is going to play a role. Another question, I know we've talked about the kind of food, how that relates to the kind of use of land, but another one that's come through is around, to what extent are biodiversity and climate goals aligned, and how do we best manage land when they are in conflict? So the example given here is solar farms on sheep grazing land, in lieu of kind of rewilding that land. I don't know whether either of you have got a perspective on that.
I think we've got to beware the straw man argument. If we simply look at the acreage percentage of the United Kingdom covered in solar farms or indeed wind turbines, that isn't the conflict. The conflict is between the misuse of land for very extensively grazed meat products, perhaps, and use of the land for carbon sequestration. But I don't see there are significant tensions between biodiversity and climate, because, as various people have pointed out, the only way now that we can save ourselves against climate change at a local, by which I mean United Kingdom level, is through the creation of Atlantic rainforest on a massive scale to once again buffer our coasts. It's the creation of the effective equivalent of mangroves, so Atlantic woodland around our shores. It's using beavers to slow flooding, but most of all, it's using trees to change the weather. Trees, of course, create weather and provide fantastic buffers against climate change. So the only way we can actually solve the climate change problem is either in the sea or on the land. And that means massive woodland planting at a scale that we haven't seen before, which will hugely play a role in biodiversity increase, provided those are native woodland plays and so on.
Great, thank you. Now we are running out of time, but I just wanted to end before we kind of wrap up with just one thing that you're both kind of hopeful about looking to the future. I know we've had quite a lot of doom and gloom today, but what are you most kind of hopeful about and excited to kind of see? Tass, I don't know if you want to start.
Sure. Well, I think I was doubtful that nature would get bumped up the agenda as quickly as it has. It feels a little bit like a younger sibling to climate, and that climate has had to do a lot of the sort of heavy lifting and fight the battles with the parents. And now nature is the younger sibling, which is kind of piggybacking on top of that, which is good. And I think ultimately the future has to see them, the two of them, aligned in a holistic way and not treated as separate things. So I suppose an amalgamation of the co-ops and an amalgamation of the two into the same treatment. But I'm very encouraged by the speed at which it's gaining traction, I'd say that much.
Brilliant.
I think for me, when we started this business a year ago, we were a startup managing 0 acres, now approaching 20,000 acres under management, and across a kind of social spectrum of NGOs, large landowners, smaller farmers, farm clusters, new money buying land, intragenerational clients. And I think it's reminded us, beyond the importance of our small company, that there is a vast demand from both people who own land and those who don't for ambitious nature restoration here in the UK and turning the tide.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much to both of you. And just a few small housekeeping bits. Thank you to all of you who've dialed in and listened to this lunchtime webinar. The recording of today's event will be available to view on demand on our website soon. And in the meantime, you can use the event link to re-listen. Please also share with anyone you think might be interested. And we'd also be hugely grateful if you could just take a couple of minutes to fill out the feedback form from the link on the engagement panel. This event is a new format for us, and your feedback really helps us to understand where we can improve and also if we should be doing more of these events. If you'd like to speak to any of us further, please do get in touch. You've seen Tass's and Benedict's details as well. So all that's left for me to say is thank you all once again and have a good rest of your afternoon.